Hey, it's Emma, Super Sensitive Human, and tonight I'm going to talk to you some more about EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, or tapping. Now, in my last video, which I'll link to in the description, I talked about an experiment I did with tapping where the results were not very amazing. Nevertheless, I could still recommend it as something to look into, something to try, because I've read the research studies and the outcomes are pretty astounding. I want to say everything I'm going to talk about is not something that you'll find if you look it up on Wikipedia, because I don't know if you know this, but Wikipedia is controlled by like a cabal of belligerent, skeptic trolls who spend all their free time changing the entries to be hyper hostile to anything that is alternative medicine or paranormal or anything like that. So I call them skeptics with a D. But even if you do read that entry for EFT on Wikipedia, what you'll see is that it actually doesn't say anything super negative about it. It doesn't say that it doesn't work. It just says it doesn't work better than standard therapies, and that we don't know why it works, because the mechanism, this whole idea of energy, subtle energy and meridians, is unproven. It says that it probably works because of the similarities that it has to regular therapy, the non-specific similarities that I just talked about. So, but what I'm going to say is going to contradict that, because Wikipedia is crazy like that. Now, EFT has only been around since 1993, but there's over 100 peer-reviewed studies on it at this point. One of the reasons that there's a lot of studies on it is because some of the researchers have taken upon themselves for it to be validated, because they've seen the results and they wanted to get it out there and accepted in the world. And as a therapy, EFT works well for being studied because it has a manualized version, and this is very important for validating something. An alternative medicine technique is that it has a standardized procedure that is written down that other people can reproduce the exact same procedure. So if you want to get Reiki or something else like that studied, ideally you're gonna have a manualized technique. You put your hands here and then you put them here and so forth. Now, in terms of EFT methodology, the basic important parts are: you have a setup statement. So you have, let's say I'm afraid of filming this video. Even though I'm afraid of filming this video, I deeply and completely accept myself. There's some kind of statement of self-acceptance that is the setup statement that you tap on to begin with. I deeply and completely love and accept myself even though I'm afraid of filming this video. And then you have focusing statements. So when you go through the other points that you tap on that are part of the manualized sequence, you're gonna keep focusing on it with statements that remind you of the thing. So you might say, this fear of filming, even though I have this fear of filming, and so on. So those are the main parts. You've got your setup, your focus statement, the tapping sequence, and your problem that you're working on, that you're aiming the whole thing toward. And those are things that are particular to EFT that are up for study, because just going to a therapist and just talking about your problems or sharing a problem is a component that is broadly found across many different therapies, and therefore any of the therapies are going to have therapeutic effects just from doing something about your problem, from talking to somebody with kindness and compassion, somebody with some authority, and so on. And those are the non-specific effects of therapy. And what researchers are interested in is the specific effects. What about the EFT is working? Is it really the meridian tapping? Does the statements have anything to do with it? And I'll get to that part, but just back up for a minute. So far out of these 100 studies, things that has been shown to be effective for are PTSD, depression, anxiety, specific phobias. Those are kind of the big four. Then you have pain, that's kind of like a fifth that's not quite as prevalently studied. And then you have some other things that are have a few studies on them, like weight loss, craving control stuff, and athletic performance. But of those top ones, there's something called effect size in research, and a small effect size is 0.2. A medium effect size is a 0.5, and a large effect size is a 0.8. And these studies with EFT have extra large effect sizes. There's for anxiety 1.23, for depression 1.31, and for PTSD 2.96. Now when it comes to this research, there are two main lines of inquiry. One is does it work, and one is why does it work? So as far as the why does it work, first question you're going to look at is why might it work besides the tapping? Because we're really not sure about this energy meridian stuff. Why else might it work? Well, some theories that have been thrown out there are, does it put you into a hypnotic trance? Now, if you are a skeptic, you don't care about the answer to that question, because a hypnotic trance is just as weird and out there as the idea of energy meridians. But in any case, there's not very much information on that. All I can say is that EFT versus hypnosis, all I can say for myself is that I do find something soothing about the cadence of the statements and the sort of monotone in which they are pronounced. Then there's the, does it work because of the affirmations? Now I'm doubtful about this, but there's also not very much research on the affirmation part. Even though such and such, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. There's research showing in general that self-acceptance is important, but there's not research around doing EFT with or without the self-acceptance statement. Not everybody uses that statement in their regular non-manualized practice. There's a lot of variations. So I'm doubtful that that is the important part, but that's just my perception of it. Then there is a breathing component. Now, not everybody uses breathing either, but some of the EFT practitioners encourage taking a breath and there's a let it go phase of the treatment where you take a breath at the end and blow it out. There are a couple studies on EFT versus deep breathing where they replace the tapping with only focusing on the emotion while breathing deeply. So in my example be fear. Breathing deeply while remembering this fear of recording. And in those ones, they show that the meridian tapping is typically, two of them have shown it to be more effective and one of them has shown it to be equally as effective. And in the one study where it was more effective, it also lasted, the EFT lasted longer. The deep breathing effects on the problem went away upon 6-month follow-up or whatever it was, where the EFT effects lasted when asking about the same issue. And that fact that the effects of EFT seem to be lasting is true of every study that has ever looked at follow-up effects. So it doesn't just go away and then come back. It lasts when you ask somebody 6 months, 3 months, a year later. And then another factor that it's similar to that other therapies are known to work on is exposure. So exposure is when you expose yourself to the thing that's making you fearful, either in your imagination or the actual thing, and in a safe, protected setting, and you do that until you feel no more anxiety when you think or are exposed to that thing. And that actually is only like 40% effective. So EFT has been shown to be more effective than exposure, because in one study for PTSD, the EFT was 90% effective. Some people have proposed that it's just mindfulness that is giving the effects, because you're focused on the feeling, you're allowing yourself to feel it, you're allowing it to perchance move through you and complete itself. And that also hasn't panned out in studies where they replaced the sequence of tapping points with mindfulness rather than deep breathing, just focusing your attention on the issue. Mindfulness was not as effective as acupoint tapping. Now, the next question that comes to mind is, do the points matter? Do you have to tap on them exactly? What's going on with the whole acupoint thing? The most contentious study, which is always brought up by the skeptics, is this study where they did regular EFT on the listed acupuncture points. They did tapping on sham points, which I believe was tapping on the forearm, along the forearm at the same number of points, but only on the arm. And they did tapping on a doll. And all three of those showed effectiveness compared to a control that wasn't effective. So then people say, well, that whole thing's bullshit then. The points don't matter. Which is not exactly true, because for one thing, there are acupoints in your fingertips. Usually you use 2, but I usually use 3. There are acupoints in your fingertips that are stimulated when you do the tapping. And if you're tapping on your arm, there's acupoints in your arms. So you'd have to be really careful not to touch any acupoints when you're doing these alternative sham procedures. So there are 6 studies total looking specifically at the acupuncture points, and that is the one that is the most equivocal. The other 5 all showed better results when tapping on the actual acupuncture points themselves. One study, the sham procedure, used, I don't know what side of the hand they used, but they, instead of using the tip of the fingers where the meridians end, they used the flat of the hand to tap, and that one was not as effective as the regular tapping with the tips of the fingers. I also want to point out something that a lot of people haven't brought up about this study, which is that I'm not sure that tapping on a doll in the point, like tapping on the side of the doll's eye, wouldn't move energy in your own eye area due to the general human tendency to be empathic and have these mirror neurons. And I find there's a lot of mix-up like that. Like when I'm dating somebody and my back hurts, I'll like start rubbing their back where my back hurts. So another question is, does the order of the points matter? And the one study, there's only been like one study on that I know of, and that said it did not matter if you tapped you know, in the right order or in a totally randomized order. So another research question to ask is, what kind of physiological effects does EFT produce? Because a lot of studies in psychology are based on validated assessments. The Beck Depression Inventory. It's this formalized survey that you do that can show your improvement before and after, but it's all based on what you're saying or what you're telling a clinician who's marking down your answers. And that's important, but a lot of people want to see physical evidence. So they want to see what kind of changes in the body are happening before and after. And there is some studies like this for EFT. So one of the things that has been shown to change is cortisol. In one study they did EFT versus a talk therapy technique, and in the studies of the people who got the EFT treatment, their cortisol, which is the stress hormone, went down more after an hour of treatment than the talk therapy or no therapy groups. And another physiological effect that has been shown is theta waves in the brain. They've done EEG studies and it shows some different changes before and after EFT. Specifically, 2 different studies showed increased theta waves, which are more relaxing. And another study showed changes in gene expression. You know, epigenetics is really hot lately, and it's just showing changes in gene expression before and after some kind of treatment has become a popular way of seeing if it made a difference. And EFT made a difference in 6 different genes in this one study, statistical difference. And one thing that's kind of missing from the EFT studies, but people suspect will be shown, is that acupuncture, there's Harvard studies showing that acupuncture needle treatment helps deactivate the amygdala, which is creates the fight or flight response and is associated with anxiety and PTSD. And given that other studies have shown that there's not very much difference between acupressure and acupuncture, it theoretically makes sense that the tapping can also calm down the amygdala. But there haven't been much studies on that for EFT yet. Another research question is, how does EFT compare to the standard treatments? Now, I've already mentioned that cognitive behavioral therapy is a standard treatment, and it actually, while Wikipedia says it's about equal, there are some studies that shows that it's more effective, and specifically more effective time-wise. Like 2 treatments of EFT may have the same effect as 6 treatments of CBT. So which one are you gonna choose? There's also the fact that those effect sizes I quoted to you earlier, the 1.23 or whatever for depression, when you do the meta-analysis to get that effect size, which was where you take like 40 studies on EFT and depression, and then you narrow it down to 15 of those that are the best designed, the randomized controlled trials, and then you look at the outcome of those 15 to get your number of how effective it is. That's the meta-analysis. And so when you take a meta-analysis of EFT and the effect size, and you compare that to your meta-analysis of antidepressants, then the EFT has a much, much greater effect size than both antidepressants and psychotherapy. Now, there's a study on PTSD where the group of veterans was given EFT along with their standard care, and the other group was just given standard care. In the EFT group, 90% of the participants recovered to the point that they were no longer eligible for the PTSD diagnosis. And meanwhile, in the standard of care group, only 4% of the participants got down to that level. So that is a dramatic difference, and that was after just 6 sessions of EFT, 6 total hours. And in another study comparing it to EMDR, the EFT and the EMDR both got rid of PTSD in 4 sessions. So to summarize what the research says, yes, EFT is effective for a variety of mental conditions, specifically PTSD, anxiety, depression, and phobias. Yes, the tapping part of it seems to be part of the effectiveness. It does seem to matter that you tap on approximately somewhere around the acupuncture points that they suggest. And no, the effectiveness does not seem to depend on its similarity to various components of the therapy, such as deep breathing or mindfulness or exposure. Yes, it does have physiological effects when you compare the before and after, and although physiological effects are easily created by the placebo effect, that doesn't mean that it doesn't come from your just believing. It's physiological effects are important to show because they tend to show up to a lesser degree and less big than psychological effects. So you know when there's physiological effects showing up, that it gives the research a slightly higher credibility than just showing that somebody subjectively said their anxiety was different on a before-after test. And is it better than the standard therapies that your insurance provider would typically pay for, or your doctor or psychologist would typically recommend? Seems to be slightly better and faster. And even if it was the same, there's a lot of reasons why you might choose it anyway. I know if you gave me the option between trying cognitive behavioral therapy and EFT, the cognitive behavioral therapy just doesn't have a good reputation for being at all fun or easy or something that you really want to do or admit that you're doing. And there's just, a lot of reasons why people might be attracted to one therapy over another that have nothing to do with the science. And even if something were slightly less effective, they might still choose it. For example, if herbal antibiotics are slightly less effective or take slightly longer than full spectrum antibiotics, then a lot of people are still going to choose them because they're worried about the side effects and wiping out all their gut bacteria. And so when it comes to EFT, one advantage is the cost of it. If you are paying out of pocket, EFT therapists do not have to be licensed psychotherapists, and so anybody with a license is more expensive than somebody without a license. And so if you can pay $60 an hour versus $120 an hour and you're paying yourself, you might want to do that. And that cost savings is beneficial to providers as well, which is why they would take on EFT, because who wants to pay for PTSD treatment for somebody that needs 12 sessions by a licensed therapist when they can pay for 6 sessions from a cheaper unlicensed therapist that's going to be just as effective or more effective? And that brings up kind of a final question, which is it more effective to do in person, or can it be done with a video or by Skype or a telephone? And there's been some studies on that, and yes, of course it's still effective, but I don't know if there's any studies that are comparing the effectiveness of in-person versus doing it on your own, or doing it not tailored specifically to you like I was doing when I was doing the tap-along videos. Like, for example, my first boyfriend from high school is a veteran with anxiety and who goes to the VA clinic, but it's an hour away from his house, which is a pain in the ass. He doesn't want to do it. He no guy wants to go to therapy in the first place. It's just like not a thing that males like to do, generally speaking. And the harder you make it, the less compliant they're gonna be. There's something like 40% of the military has PTSD, which is awful. And the majority of people with the diagnosis have not sought treatment within 1 year of receiving the diagnosis. So the easier that you can make it, the better. So in closing, I would encourage researchers to look at the delivery in person or versus not some more. I would like to see more research on the physiological effects and EFT for diseases, because I read one study that where they did it on diabetes and it said it lowered the hemoglobin A1C, but that was kind of a poorly translated Iranian study. So if you can lower your blood sugar, what else can you do? Can you lower your blood pressure? I mean, the possibilities are endless for studying. Me, I would study if it can get you a boyfriend or make you more money, but I don't think that many scientists are ready to go there. What else would I like to know? It'd be interesting to know if it could be, if there's a version that could be like sort of more discreet EFT where you're not tapping on your face, because that's kind of weird to do in public. What if you could do it just by tapping on your arms or hands? So if you're starting to have a panic attack in the middle of a cafeteria, you can start doing the tapping without anybody seeing you. That would be a good to have discreet alternative. And one where you maybe don't figure out if it matters if you say the stuff out loud, because that's also not very discreet. To be shouting out in your office cubicle about how much you deeply and completely love yourself. So that's my hot take. If you want to know more about the name of a specific study or the details of a specific study, let me know in the comments, because there's too many, I'm not going to list them. You can find for yourself a listing of studies at EFTuniverse.com, and there's a research section that is updated with every new study that comes out. And but you can't read, you can only read the abstracts when you click on those. What I do is I go to Google Scholar and put the name of the article in there and see if it'll give me a free one. And if it doesn't give me a free one just from Google Scholar alone, I have a special Russian browser bar that will give me whatever article I want for free, like 80% of them anyway. I don't feel like I'm doing anything unethical when I do that, like I'm cheating out the research journals of their money, because I have access to the research journals. My university pays for my access to my research journals. I just don't use the library website because it takes a lot longer than finding it on Google Scholar with my special browser extension.